Greetings, my civic students. We're going to talk about a couple of things today. I'm going to try to really get through the judicial branch in a big hurry, and then we're going to talk about what civil and criminal trials will look like. So here's something to make very, very clear. This is the biggest mix-up students will have. For instance, they may say, well, like a felony is a federal case. Maybe it sounds similar. That's not true. Most of the everything in America is actually dealt with in a state court. There are federal and there are state courts, and both kinds hear civil and criminal cases. So, for instance, you could have a civil state case. You could also have a civil federal case. Likewise, with criminal, there are things that are civil disputes in a state, and there are things you may have to deal with on the federal government. There are crimes you can commit that are a crime in one state, and yet it's not a crime in another state, or may not be a crime on a federal level. As far as the state-to-state thing, marijuana could be an example, right? Marijuana for recreational use in Colorado, Washington, I don't know, I lose track of what states it's actually legal in now. It's legal there, and their state may not deal with it in one way, but in another state, it is a crime. And likewise, it could also be dealt with on a federal level as well if it was seen. Usually, the reason you would escalate something to the federal level is if it can only be tried on, like, for instance, you break into a post office. A post office is a federal building, so it could be dealt with in a federal court. You break into a school, that's a state building, so it would be dealt with in a state court. There could be an instance like, let's say, for instance, you thought that you were not going to be treated fairly in a state court for a multitude of reasons. One I've given in a common because I'm a racing guy. If you ever go look up Tony Stewart and Kevin Ward, Tony Stewart ends up hitting and killing a driver who had gotten out of his car in upstate New York. Now, Tony Stewart was from Indiana, living in North Carolina, NASCAR guy, and there was a possibility of charging him for murder in New York for that incident on the track. You can actually Google and watch the video of that incident if you want. He actually moved that case to federal court because Tony Stewart felt like, since he was from out of state, he was kind of like the hot shoe coming in, drawing in a lot of attendance. There was a thought that maybe a New York state court would not try him fairly. So he got the same murder charge moved to a federal court. It's kind of an example of concurrent jurisdiction you may see. You do need to know the differences in civil versus criminal. Civil could be, as the examples listed. Civil basically means nobody can go to jail for whatever's being done here. And most of the time, you're going to be dealing with this on a state level. Remember that concurrent jurisdiction would mean it could be held in a state or federal court. Exclusive, only one court can hear it. It could often be, there's a once in a decade issue that might come up that goes straight to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court may hold original jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction is just who gets to hear a case first. Usually it's going to be a district court someplace. And in normal classroom situations, knowing these types of jurisdictions is important. So as far as, here are things that would go straight to federal court. If it makes sense, the state cannot interpret the national constitution. Hopefully that makes sense. A North Carolina court cannot tell the whole country what the U.S. Constitution means. Likewise, the U.S. courts are not supposed to be able to tell North Carolina what its own constitution means. So a constitutional law would just be anything involving something we've talked about back in our Bill of Rights unit. Anything that involves, I'm saying my constitutional rights were violated. As I'm recording this in the COVID-19 era of American history now, I've seen signs, for instance, that Florida is saying that they're actually doing checkpoints when you come into the state and trying to quarantine people who are from New York, where there's a lot of coronavirus cases, stopping people from entry. There's actually constitutional issues where that pertain to traveling from state to state. And so if you try to sue Florida, you could potentially say, my constitutional rights are being violated by Florida, not allowing me to travel into their state. A federal law, anything that is breaking a federal law. A really good example, other than what's listed here, patents and inventions. You steal an iPhone and you publish something. It looks just like an iPhone, acts like an iPhone, but it's not an iPhone. You're taking Apple's money. That would be an example of what's listed here with patent law. There have been certainly a lot of patent law cases. Hate crimes. Hate is a motivation for a crime. It is not necessarily a crime itself. I know back in my Constitution unit, I teach the difference in hate speech and hate law. Hate speech is allowed in America. It's not a good way to earn friends. It could get you fired from work, but you cannot be prosecuted for hate speech. You may see in America, for instance, if you act on that, Dylan Roof is a really good example. If you go look up the Dylan Roof from a few years ago, he was the one, he was a white male who shot and killed several members of a black church in Charleston, South Carolina. He admitted that he did it because he hates black people. And he said he felt like the world would be better off if they weren't there. And that's why he did it. I mean, it doesn't get any more hate crime than that. Hate is a motivation based on race or sexuality or something to that effect. So that would escalate something to a federal case. Hate crime is federal. So again, any crime that breaks a federal law will most likely be heard in a federal case. An example of why I said may, if it's also a state law, the federal government may choose to leave it in a state court. If something happens, keep in mind, like Falls Lake or Jordan Lake is not maritime law. This is talking about things that happen on ocean on an American ship. If you are suing the American government, you can't sue the American government in a state court. Hopefully it makes sense why. Citizens of different states, if you're trying to say that, like, you know, North Carolina is going to be more fair to me as I'm a North Carolina resident and I'm suing somebody in Virginia, there could be an issue where both of our courts are going to be unfair to us, so we just move on to a federal court. This happens about once a decade or so. California and Arizona have fought over who controls the Arizona or the Colorado River that runs between their states. North Carolina and South Carolina have been fighting over this boundary around Charlotte area, around Carowinds, for 100 years. So about once a decade, there's an issue to go straight to the Supreme Court. All that sense. I don't even know if this has ever happened. If you find an instance, drop it in the comments. If an ambassador working for the United States in their official capacity, keep in mind, this isn't they went out on their private time and got drunk and then drove into a building or something. This is, as an ambassador on their official duty, as an ambassador from the United States, commits a crime in another country, there's actually original jurisdiction to the Supreme Court. If we're another but if another government, it has to be a Supreme Court. If it does an ambassador, it has to go to a nurse. This is not my term, inferior court. This is the term from the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution, there shall be Supreme Court and inferior court. And we're going to talk about those. Most courts that you have seen are district courts. And I'll have an assignment later. District court, just there's got to be one per state. That's about the only thing the Constitution says. And it's where pretty much almost all federal cases begin. And that's the end of them. So the district court would handle any federal law, any federal cases that have already been talked about. They usually would use a jury. And then there is a judge who acts in a sense that you have always seen. If you've watched a court show on TV, you've pretty much seen how a judge acts. The judge is ultimately the one who arbitrates between two sides and ultimately interprets the law, keeps the trial running smoothly. Now, this is a spot where in class I like to play a little gotcha question. I'll ask, what's the requirement to be a judge? And usually, I get various answers by saying, the president has to be 35, a senator has to be 30, a congressman has to be 25. There's a citizenship requirement. There's a residency requirement, maybe. What is the requirement to be a judge? It's a trick question. There aren't any. The only requirement is that they be appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. And once they are appointed and have their approval from the Senate, they serve. The Constitution says a term of good behavior, and that has been interpreted as until the end of their life, unless they resign before they die. Some liberals out there might be a big fan of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been at this for a long time. She's, as I record this, the oldest Supreme Court justice. She's going to be there until she passes on. It's also, just to jump on a political stump for a second, I'm not going to take a side one way or the other. The Supreme Court is very conservative right now. And if you like that, then vote accordingly. But it actually, I used to have a question up we had on test in civics about how can a president impact American policy many, many years after he or she is no longer president. The answer to that question was actually around this. It was in the judges that they have appointed. There was a lot of speculation about about Brett Kavanaugh and his going on the Supreme Court. The man's about 50 years old. I would even say only in his 50s. If we look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's in her 90s, I mean, Brett Kavanaugh could be making decisions for your whole entire adult life, likely will be making Supreme Court decisions along with 8 other justices for your whole life. So it's important when you vote. When it was, it looks like it's going to be, as I record this, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. One thing you need to think about is, who do I want making court appointees who will interpret decisions for my adult life? If you are happy with conservative judges, you may want to consider Trump. If you're not happy with what courts are deciding right now, you may want to consider an alternative. As far as my proof of how there is no requirement for you to be a judge, I do want to encourage you to take a couple minutes and watch this. His nomination was ultimately pulled back by Trump. Hopefully the audio works. And come on, play. I'm not going to play the whole video. A deposition, by the way, all that is a testimony from someone who's not in court. So if I can't have you there, I would go interview you as though you were in court, and then I'll submit your deposition in a trial. It doesn't get much better. Basically, he can't answer any question he is given. His nomination was retracted. But the point being, there are no requirements to be a judge, just that you get through the Senate and be appointed by the president. Not in that order, though. If you do decide you don't like your decision that you got in a district court, you can potentially appeal to an appeals court, which hold appellate jurisdiction, a new type of jurisdiction you need to know about there. And very few cases make it here. And you actually cannot appeal just because you don't like the decision. You have to say, well, they found me guilty, but it was unfair. The evidence they used to convict me was unconstitutional. There was an error. The trial I was given was very unfair. The jury, I was a African-American male with an all-white jury. That was unfair. That's the sort of thing you could appeal for. There's no jury. You can actually argue an appeals case over the phone. I was not aware of that until Trump's travel ban was actually heard. You could actually listen to the phone arguments online when that court case was being decided. So there's no jury, never is, never will be. They do not determine innocence or guilt, but and you don't necessarily have to have that unanimous thing like you would in a jury, unanimous find guilty or whatnot. All you really have to have is a majority of the judges. Usually in the appeals courts, there's 3 judges. And just if 2 out of 3, or maybe 3 out of 3, decide that they're on your side, you're granted an appeal. And the only case you're guaranteed is a death penalty. You're guaranteed that you will get an appeal in a death penalty case. That's it. They can do three things. Most of the time, they will uphold a case, in which case they look over to district court, they hear your argument, and they say, no, your court case was actually fair, and we stand by the decision of our lower court. They can reverse the decision. Usually this might be in a civil case. For instance, court case says that your speech in school was unconstitutional. Appeals court might look at it and say, no, that's wrong. Actually, your speech was constitutional. Usually that's going to be in a yes or no. Remand you might see in more of a criminal case, or this might be one of those unfairness or error situations. Let's say, for instance, you're tried with a jury that was already biased. Then the decision could be, we're going to send your case back down for a new decision. You have to have a more unbiased jury. That will be a remand. Sent back to a lower court to be retried. So let's talk about the Supreme Court. It functions like an appeals court, so that'll make it a lot easier to hear. There's nowhere to go after you've been to the Supreme Court. It is seen as like that high bastion of democracy. Civil rights movement, when Congress wouldn't listen to civil rights movement, when the president wouldn't listen, the courts would listen. So it was the courts that said schools are to be unsegregated. As far as gay marriage goes, in 2015, it was the Supreme Court that said that marriage cannot be restricted on the grounds of sex or on grounds of gender, for instance, between the two people involved. It was actually the courts who stepped in there. It was not Congress. It was not the president. It was the courts. So anything in our lives that we see like we're being treated unfairly, when Congress won't listen, when president won't listen, we go to the Supreme Court, and hopefully they will do what's right when no one else will. They may overturn themselves years later if you don't like their decision. Roe v. Wade, for instance, that's been a decision since the 70s. It goes back to what I was saying about vote accordingly when you vote for president. The president appoints these people with the approval of the Senate. So you need to vote for presidents who are going to appoint justices who make decisions you feel are right. Roe v. Wade is the law of the land, and that is the law of the land unless the Supreme Court changes it, or unless we can pass a constitutional amendment, and we already had a unit on that. So that's tough. So the Supreme Court interpretation is, for 99.9999% of cases, final. There's a couple of amendments to the Constitution for things that the Supreme Court did that Congress didn't like, but your chances of getting that done, I mean, it hasn't happened in a century. What you're basically going to count on is the court later change its own mind. They do have a check and balance that we need to talk about. You've probably seen the term judicial review. But it's been around for a couple of hundred years, and you can actually go look up a list of laws that have been reviewed, and there's been thousands of them, and on a couple of hundred occasions, the courts have actually exercised judicial review over a federal law. Actually, any district or appeals court can also exercise judicial review. Supreme Court, it is currently made up of 9 justices. That's not in the Constitution. People think it is, but it's not. It's not there. There is nothing there that says that that's the number. If you go back to American history, you may remember FDR's court packing scheme. He actually tried to add justices to the court to help his New Deal. That didn't make it. We've already talked about appointing to the president. It's just like the districts and all district and appeals courts are appointed by the president with Senate approval. The Supreme Court, it makes more news. That's all. This is just a general breakdown of how it works. I'll just leave this here for a second or two if you want to record it. I wouldn't worry too much about this. This is the nuts and bolts that you don't really need to worry about. The justices decide. Basically, you need 5 out of 9 justices to decide to hear your case, maybe 4 out of 9 if you can get the chief justice involved. And they make the same decisions as an appeals court would make. I do want to talk about majority, concurring, and dissenting opinion. They do not have anything to do with if the case is a yes or no. Majority just means it's the opinion of the majority of the justices. That majority opinion could be an overturn. That majority opinion could also be an uphold, as could a dissenting opinion. Majority is just whatever the majority of the court says. The majority opinion is always the decision of the court, always. Concurring opinion is just someone who goes along with, yes, it's legal, no, it's not legal, but they have a different rationale for how to get there. They're pretty unusual. Right now, dissenting opinions are very common. They always have been, really. You have a conservative majority on the Supreme Court as I record this. So the liberals, who will disagree with the conservatives by nature, in a sense, will write their own dissenting opinion for why they disagree with those conservative majorities. And so you do need to know about those types of opinions. Please feel free to drop in comments if you have questions, concerns, comments, or complaints, corrections, whatever you feel you need to put in. Hopefully this video was helpful.